Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait just a minute to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Okay, we'll take just another minute or two before we get started. Okay, so welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's conversation is focused from challenges to triumphs, lessons learned in 2023, and a roadmap to 2024. My name is Kristen Green. I'm the new director of K-12 at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded in 2001 by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. And we serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. So before getting the conversation started, I want to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start with a moderated discussion with our panelists and then pivot to a Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the discussion. Additionally, we'll record this conversation in the next couple of days, posted on our YouTube channel. All right. So we encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom, and we'll also be live tweeting from our Twitter account at the Hunt Institute. Speaking of today's conversation, we're so appreciative of the panelists who are joining us today to discuss the challenges and triumphs of the past year in education, and to give us their predictions for what 2024 will bring. 2023 saw the end of the 22-23 school year, the end of the first full school year since the pandemic shutdowns. The school year had a heavy emphasis on learning recovery and addressing the challenges of learning loss, as well as the beginning of the 23-24 school year, which held opportunities for the implementation of new programs focused on mental health services in schools and after-school programming. So one source of insight to the challenges of the 2022-2023 school year are outlined in the Hunt Institute's 2023 Across the Aisle survey, which works to cut through the noise and measure parent priorities in education. Voters across all races, political parties, and geographic areas identified what they see as the biggest problems in education. So this press release also went live today about Across the Aisle, and you can find the full report on our website. So today's a big day. We're really excited to have our panelists here and you have access to our Across the Aisle data as well. So on the screen, you'll find kind of a high-level view of what voters see as the biggest problems facing education today. So the not teaching real-world skills for future workforce is coming in as the highest concern from parents, from community members. Ensuring public schools are safe, our students are safe in the schools. Literacy, not reading at grade level, is another top concern. Teacher salaries, compensation, so that's something that we're seeing across the country. Ensuring public schools are free of bullying, to include a very clear note on cyberbullying. So the full Across the Aisle report is released today, as we mentioned, and it can be found on the Hunt Institute's website. I believe that was dropped into the chat, so you can click on that and have it good to go for a review after our session. All right. So let's jump in. Throughout today's discussion, we'll hear from national experts about the current state of education at the end of 2023 and learn what you're anticipating for 24. To that end, I'm pleased to introduce our full panel of speakers today. So Dr. James Lane is the Chief Executive Officer of PDK International, which leads the PDK poll on public's attitude towards public schools and educators rising. which focuses on strengthening the teacher pipeline by building connections between stakeholders and funding sources. Dr. Lane most recently served as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education for the Biden-Harris administration. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lane.
Thank you.
Yeah, Secretary Katie Jenner is Indiana's first Secretary of Education. She leads the Indiana Department of Education and chairs the State Board of Education. Her leadership focuses on three key pillars: student learning and opportunity, educator talent, quality, and value, and system alignment and capacity. Thank you, Secretary Jenner.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And finally, Dr. Faiza Jamil. Dr. Jamil is the director and founder of the Context of Learning and Development Lab and is an associate professor at Clemson University College of Education. Her research focuses on understanding and improving the educational experiences of teachers and students. Most recently, she authored Public Education in Turbulent Times, Innovative Strategies for Leadership and Learning with Dr. Javed Siddiqui, CEO of the Hunt Institute. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jamil.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, we are going to jump right in. As a reminder for our audience, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. So Dr. Lane, we're going to start with you. PDK International maintains one of the longest running polls on public attitudes towards public education. This polling has shown that the majority of parents, 62% of parents, do not want their children to become educators, a number that has been rising steadily since 2018. How do the PDK poll results compare to the across the aisle findings? And how does this reflect the context of learning in 2023?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, and I'm excited to be with the Hunt Institute today. The PDK poll polls a slightly different population than the across the aisle poll, but a lot of the data actually tracks really closely. We have been polling essentially the average American. Ours is based on the US Census rather than likely voters, but you would imagine that those two groups are largely similar. And the big themes that came out of our poll this year align in a lot of ways to what I read in the preview for the across the aisle poll. Probably the biggest finding that we saw was that an overwhelming majority of Americans believe that teachers are overworked, underpaid, and undervalued. And we actually asked a question around, would you be willing to accept a revenue increase, tax increase, whatever you want to call it, to pay teachers more? And there was actually broad support for that if it paired with, great outcomes for students. But then we got into some of the more specific attitudes around public education. And one of the questions that we asked was, who should have the most influence on curriculum decisions? And we're a little bit shocked by some of the results because often what we hear in the media and on social media doesn't pair with what actually came out of our polling. And what we found was that an overwhelming number of Americans want teachers to have the most influence over what's taught in classrooms, more so than, say, state government legislatures, even school boards or citizens in the community and the such. But it was interesting because when we really dug in on that in the poll, there is a strong place for the state to have a lot of influence. And so basically what came out of that, and I'm going to put it in layman's terms, is they wanted the state to set the guardrails for essentially what could be going on in schools from a curricular standpoint. But then once those guardrails were set, they wanted the people working closest with the students, like the teachers, to have the most influence. The part of our poll that probably caught the most attention was around flexible school schedules, and that because our poll has been going on for 50, 60 years, we have the benefit of a lot of longitudinal data. And if you look back a few decades ago, maybe only a quarter of Americans thought about 4-day school weeks or longer school days or longer school years going into the summer. But now, flash forward just a couple decades later, and there is now over 50% of Americans wanting to see more flexibility in the way that schedules are approached. And so what I read from that, and where I really think it pairs well with across the aisle, is that people largely support the schools where their kids go. there's interesting data around overwhelming support for the local school in your community. But like in across the aisle, a lot of Americans are concerned about schools more broadly or in general. And so when we dug into those type of themes a little bit more, what we found is that Americans really do want to see our schools get better. They want to see students recover. An interesting piece of the poll we found was that a majority of Americans support actually screening students for mental health issues. And they want to make sure that the leaders in our schools are moving our schools forward. And so when I looked at some of the data around people having concerns in the across the aisle poll about the effectiveness of public schools, I think in large part that's that pairs well with what we see around this broad concern about schools. But I think the big difference when we really get into nuance is that it's often not the school in the community, but really the portrayal or the perception of how schools are doing in the broader sense. Now, of course, we know from student academic achievement data, when we look back at 23 and 22, that students are struggling in reading and math more than they have pre-pandemic. And so I think our families want to continue to see a focus there. And I think that paired very well with what we saw in across the aisle.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. Appreciate that. And just for the audience, we have the PDK poll in the chat as well. So you can reference that with across the aisle. All right, so we'll shift to Dr. Jamil. How would you describe the state of current educator workforce? How are institutions of higher education working to support the educator pipeline in the face of these national teacher shortages?
Thank you for that question. It's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about for sure. I would say that, to frame that question's answer, a couple of things that I think higher ed institutions are doing well is we're really trying to contextualize the answer, right? The workforce, by and large, we know is facing a teacher shortage. The pipeline is leaky, right? We bring a lot of people in, but we have a hard time retaining them, but the causes and the solutions might be different from place to place. So as a context researcher, that's something I think about a lot. It's also important to think about those things separately in terms of recruitment and retention. So, we are trying very hard to bring new potential teachers into the pipeline. So those recruitment efforts, I think, are really focused a lot in the higher ed sphere on things like affordability. We've nationally having a conversation about the cost of college. And so using things like early college credits in high school, building relationships with institutions, two-year colleges to help sort of lessen the cost burden is one of the places where there's a lot of focus. Creating alternative pathways so that we can bring people into the preparation pathways at different points in their careers. One of the things that's happened a lot since the pandemic is people have discovered they have options, or they're willing to take risks in terms of trying new career pathways as well. So trying to focus on that. But I think that Dr. Lane, brought up an important piece, which is the profession has a touch of a messaging problem, right? In terms of the effectiveness of schooling and teachers, that perception varies broadly for the field, even if people are satisfied with their local schools and teachers that their children are attending. But also, one of the things we saw during the pandemic, and actually Dr. Siddiqui and I covered this in our book recently quite extensively, is the stories of the actual experiences of teachers that we're hearing were important to dig into. Initially in the early parts of the pandemic, teachers were heroes, right? There were lots of things that were going on where they were making a valuable contribution and the public perception was largely positive. But I think what we're seeing is there's also been challenges related to the profession itself, right? The professionalization of teachers, perceiving them as experts in what they do, and creating opportunities for their hard work to shine in a positive way. So for institutions of higher ed, a lot of those connections with local school districts, speaking to high school and middle school students, reaching down and sort of helping them see the possibilities of themselves as teachers has been a really important piece of building that professional culture and a sense of belongingness to the profession. On the other hand, the retention challenges, I think, have been largely highlighted through the challenges, the mental health challenges in schools, the stresses that teachers have faced. So a lot of our focus has been on how do we build positive support systems for students, but also for the teachers and the adults in their lives. And so a lot of what we've seen success with is supporting professional learning communities. Again, a part of creating that professional culture and respecting context is how do teachers work together in their local school districts to support what is going on individually with students in individual classrooms, and really creating time for that. The importance of supporting, institutions of higher ed like mine, supporting professional learning in the surrounding districts, providing opportunities for engagement for teachers, but not as let us go in and fix it, but how can we partner with you in finding resources and helping, to support the work that they see as necessary, has been an important part of what we're doing too. And of course, the other piece is the human needs. Part of why I went to graduate school many years ago was to really start to think about teachers as human beings and, who isn't going to be an effective teacher dispositionally, but how do we support the growth of those soft skills, those relational skills that make schools safe places within a community, within a classroom, but also help teachers experience success. So I think a lot of those supports have been a big piece of where we've been focused, and developing programming to support those needs in the school systems, because it's very easy for us to do large data set research, but we are usually an asset in a local community. We're surrounded by school districts, and the more as educational professionals we can step in and build those relationships within districts, it's a really important part of the role that we have to do. So that has been a big piece of how we've been, I think, moving forward to help plug the holes in the pipeline, support access points, but also provide resources where there are points of attrition for teachers in the field as well. And of course, pay increases. We already know that that's, teachers need to be able to afford to go into the profession, pay off their student loans, and have a livable wage. And so to the extent that we can reduce the burden and the cost of entry, the greater our chances are of helping that be a viable option for our highest achieving students as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jamil. Appreciate that. As Secretary Jenner, the 2023 Indiana legislative session saw more than 100 new education bills introduced, ranging from textbook investments and higher education funding to parental involvement and early literacy. Given this robust legislative agenda, how does your office partner with policymakers to support legislation aimed at meeting the salient student needs in a changing education landscape?
So, Kristen, thank you for the question. Thank you for allowing me to join you today for this conversation. It's interesting, and it didn't even occur to me, but when you flashed the chart up just a bit ago with that data, I was leaning in to take a cell phone picture of it, and I literally took it and highlighted. I was listening to you, James, as you were speaking, by the way, as I was doing all this. I highlighted two of the key areas on the top line on real world skills for kids and rethinking high school, and then also the reading piece, and sent it straight to our Speaker of the House, straight to our President Pro Tem of the Senate, and to our governor. And that is the kind of relationship that we have today. But it was not always that way in Indiana. So for any state listening who's struggling, there's hope, I promise. But we've worked really, really hard on that relationship over the past decade almost, our top line news articles were how the Department of Ed is arguing with the State Board of Ed and the governor and the Senate and the House. Our relationships were really, really strained. And our General Assembly, a few years back, under both Democrat and Republican governors at different points, over 5 different governors, had really pushed for an appointed Secretary of Education. Because in most states, like in Indiana, education's half the budget. So it's a $9 billion budget that we have as state dollars in education. And it's really important that the governor and I work hand in hand. So I am the first appointed secretary. And so when coming into this role, the governor was like, can you stop all the fighting and focus on moving the needle for kids? And so we've worked very, very hard to build relationships with people across both sides of the aisle, with parents, with higher ed, with of course, our K-12 educators, so in business and industry, a number of different stakeholders. That involves a lot of listening, a lot of being really honest about our data. We can't hide from it. We have to own it. The good, the bad, the ugly, we own it. Keeping students, thirdly, as our North Star. And then being really, really clear that we're not going to admire the problem on repeat. We've got to go after the solutions. And if we hit the first time on nailing that solution, it's sure better than sitting back and not trying at all. So let's learn from that and let's go at it again. To the points that our first 2 speakers said, I mean, we just have too much in education that can be improved, that is right there for us to get at. And so we're just now rolling up our sleeves, trying to work together, because that's how we move faster. So to all those other states, again, there is hope, but it does take time and a lot of relationship building to get there. You're muted. Do you want me to keep talking like a fill in the gap?
Technical difficulties with my mouse. Thank y'all. Thank you so much for painting that picture for us, Secretary Jenner. I'd love to ask a follow-up for all of you. And a reminder, submit your questions in for our panelists in our Q&A. So about teacher prep programs, talking about the relationships between our government officials and legislators, and then just our data, right? What does that look like going into 2024? So our audience today is made up of diverse stakeholders, including policymakers, elected officials, classroom educators, and more. We're all interested in knowing, as we look ahead, what education priorities do you anticipate in 2024? Secretary Jenner, will put you in the hot spot first.
I love this hot spot because again, now that we have the relationships, the dynamic has really changed in Indiana. So no longer is the Department of Education surprised by bills that are filed. And by the way, there are always going to be bills that are filed, no matter what state you're in, that some that you agree with and some that you disagree with. The key is, do they see the light of day, number 1, and do they die, number 2? And if they're good, do they survive? And do they get signed into law? So our team has been actively meeting again with both sides of the aisle, both chambers, on our key priorities. The first one was actually made your list, ensuring every child can read by the end of 3rd grade, and that we're so that's one of the focuses. And then we'll also be really mindful of those adolescent students who are sitting in our classrooms who are not reading at grade level right now, or maybe not reading at all. Our teachers are saying, right, they're there and they're causing behavioral challenges sometimes and embarrassed other times. And what can we do about that? So that will be number 1. We'll have another big bill. We had a major session, as many states did, on science of reading last session, to deploy a lot of resources, a lot of supports for our teachers, but another session that will again be focused on more triaging for our kids. Second, chronic absenteeism. New York Times really shined a spotlight on this probably in September-ish when they said, as a nation, of our 72 million kids, 25% are chronically absent, missing 10% of the school year. So in a time where we're trying, educators are working to try to overcome the learning gaps and challenges that we have, to not have some of our most at-risk student populations at school is a real challenge. In Indiana, we immediately ran our data, presented it publicly to shine that light. We're at 19.3% are chronically absent, which is about a month of school. So that is our second priority. Thirdly, we are going to follow the lead of about 12 states that have already done this, but we're redesigning our state assessment as a through-year assessment. So it's not just a one-time summative at the end of the year. We've learned a lot from other states who've gone before us, and really working with our educator partners to make that data more useful, more meaningful for our teachers and our parents. Fourth, and this was also top of your list, the urgent need to rethink high school and rethink how we're preparing our students with the skills for the future. So we had another major bill last session that started this work. And one of the charges in that bill was to, and this will resonate with other state and policy makers, I think, but one piece in that was requiring our State Board of Ed to totally build out a student-centered, future-focused diploma, which so much of our high school in America hasn't changed for 100 years when the Carnegie Unit started. I mean, it's time. And so part of that bill was that the State Board of Ed had to rule make on new diplomas, and yet we can't rule make if it's in the statute. And so there are over 100 provisions in statute about diplomas that have been added year over year over year for a long period of time. So we have a bill to sunset a lot of the old, almost all of the old, to give us the freedom to build new. And that'll be due to the state in December of 2024. Fifth, increasing the number of students taking computer science. We're number 6 in the nation in terms of access for computer science. 91% of our kids have access. So we have our computer science standards spiral from K through 8 throughout our science standards. And then we have all high schools are required to offer computer science. But then when you look at who is taking it, it's only about 23%. So we are going to push to have that as one of our required classes, especially at a time when we're talking about AI, which is obviously one of the arms within computer science in a number of areas. And then finally, I'll just mention, we were one of the only 7 states in our country who were not paying for textbooks as a state. We were charging parents. So our governor took that on last year, and we've learned some lessons by collecting that data. Whereas you might have, if each of you are a kindergarten parent, you might be paying $150 for your kindergartner. Somebody else might be paying $300 for your kindergartner. So now that taxpayer dollars are paying this bill, we really, and it's long overdue in our state, but needing to ask the question of what exactly are we buying? And is it high quality curriculum? Is it helping our teachers? Is it moving the needle for kids? So we'll have a piece that requires us to collect that data to understand if we have high quality curriculum across all of our schools. Big session again, and we're ready for it. We're pumped about it.
Thank you, Secretary Joyner. Excited for you in 2024. Dr. Jamil, will you give us your perspective?
Absolutely. So the secretary just dug so wonderfully into curriculum. So I'll focus on context. I think that a couple of pieces that I think are going to have been important and are going to continue to be increasingly important. One is just connectivity. So many students are still in rural settings, and during the pandemic, we learned the importance of access to high-speed internet. And I think that as the ESSER funds go away, we might, there's still so many infrastructure needs around helping schools be connected. And I think that's going to be an issue that's going to continue to be important. The two other pieces that I think are still developing, one of them is the mental health challenges. You know, a lot of the mental health impacts of isolation and loneliness and sort of disconnection in schools are still developing. You know, we keep seeing reports about how kids are hurting. You know, there's a sort of an epidemic of loneliness in schools. And the more we can do to shore up those social connections, I think next year that's going to continue to be a priority, because, you know, it's hard to learn how to read or do math if I don't want to be in school because I'm in emotional pain. And, you know, one of the concerns I know that as we look forward is, will those mental health supports that were added in during the pandemic using a lot of emergency funds that were made available, will those go away, right? We need to find ways to make sure these personnel in schools that are supporting our students and our teachers are still there, and able to continue doing that important work. And I think institutions of higher ed and counseling programs in higher ed institutions, we have a role to play in that. And we're going to continue to engage our local school districts in ways that are hopefully supportive. And then I think finally, and this is again a long-term thing that's happening, is really thinking about our student population and how it's changing. You know, we have an increasingly diverse population of students in our schools, and we still have a very white teacher workforce. And so with all the efforts that are going on to increase the diversity of the teacher workforce, lots of policy and programmings in that area, one of the things that my work has been looking at is we still don't have a great deal of data systematically being collected on those demographics, so we can track the changes taking place and the effectiveness of those policies. So for sure, Secretary Jenner's, you know, the idea of openness with our state data and our state data systems, a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to make more of that data publicly available so policymakers can actually start tracking not only the changes in the teacher demographics over time across states, but how is that impacting student outcomes? Where is that making a difference? Where should those investments be made in more targeted ways because they're having an impact? In a lot of ways, that's an important educational equity issue, and we don't always frame it as such. And it's a really important part of our teacher pipeline issue that we're dealing with as well. So the more we can increase who we're bringing into the profession, because with these fresh perspectives and new stories come new solutions, right? And the more we can do that recruiting within school districts so that people who are a part of a community are also now turning around and entering the profession in support of that community. I think the stronger that pipeline gets. And I know Dr. Lane shared an interesting statistic a little while ago about how people are often teaching within 20 miles of there they went to high school. And that's great because that provides local knowledge and history and an understanding of culture that I think is really important in addressing that first issue of mental health. The more we have teachers who know their students and their community and are part of it, the more effective we can be in implementing these wonderful curricular changes and creating sort of spaces where communities thrive and where schools are at the center of that. So that's where I see sort of in the next year, some real attention being focused.
Dr. Jamil, you talked about the significance of data. So I think we're lucky to have Dr. Lane here. Can you kind of round us out of what you see coming down the pike in 2024?
Yeah, for sure. Well, 2024 will be an interesting year in a lot of ways with obviously campaigns ramping up, primaries, elections. And I think that anytime that you're in that environment, you're going to see a lot of new ideas, and you're going to see a lot of challenging assumptions of the viability of each of those ideas. But a few things are going to remain. I'm going to double down on a few things we heard from Secretary Jenner and Dr. Jamil, but I have a few more I want to add, and then a hope that I have, because I do see a couple of my old colleagues that work in Congress on the call. one of the areas that we talked about briefly earlier, but is really top of mind to educators in the field is the teacher shortage. And I think that you're going to continue to see in state legislation continued pushes to improve teacher compensation, like we saw in almost every state in the last couple of years. You're going to see a lot of focus on getting more people into the pipeline, diversifying the pipeline. But then I think Dr. Jamil is right. I think that people are starting to realize that the shortage is as much a retention issue as it is a pipeline issue. Now, the pipeline is struggling as well. And many of you know that PDK International, we also run Educators Rising, which is essentially Future Teachers of America's new brand, where we encourage high school students to get into the field of education. And what we're learning about folks getting into the field and folks leaving the field or getting into the pipeline is that compensation definitely remains top of mind, but also the ability to have the time to do the things you need to do really resonates with teachers. And I was reflecting with a colleague the other day. We really haven't thought about the daily school schedule and whether it's supportive of instruction since we made the change to block schedule, which was largely driven because we wanted an overemphasis on math and reading, which I think is important. But to one of the points that Dr. Jenner said is there's been a lot of talk in 2023 about the science of reading, and that focus on improving reading results will continue. But I think that there's going to be a push for, and it may not actually be called this, but whatever the next thing is related to the science of mathematics. Because we know that a lot of especially our elementary teachers, get into elementary instruction for that love of reading and everything else. And a lot of the data that we see is that a lot of new teachers are not as confident in their ability around mathematics. And so I think you're going to see, whether it's a science of math or a confidence in math or something going on there, is going to be a big talk in 2024. But Dr. Jamil hit one of the other big pieces, and that is it's often referred to as the fiscal cliff, which is this notion that come September 30th of 2020, the ESSER funds, the final set of ESSER funds, the ARP funds, will begin to expire. Now, the department did announce after I left some flexibility around late liquidation, but ultimately all of those funds will have to be obligated by September 30th. And so districts are really going to be chomping at the bit to have deep conversations with state legislators and federal legislators around what the future of education funding will be, because those funds in large part were really essential to academic recovery efforts, mental health efforts, teacher shortage efforts. And I think that to see some of that growth sustain, I think we have some reason to believe that we've slowed the decline in student results, and hopefully we're going to start to see increases in student results coming forward. I think investments in education are going to continue to be a focus. The other thing that I would say is I think there's going to be a continued deep conversation on the role of AI in education. Whether that's from the vendor space, because they're developing so many new products that can do many things, or whether there's policy around that to put guardrails to protect students. I think that's going to be a big conversation in the new year. And I think that when AI first came out, there was, all kinds of camps setting up with the people like, we need to ban it because it can help students cheat. And then there were the people that were like, no, this is going to, flow innovation and make education more efficient. And then there were people that were worried about whether this would impact, teacher contracts and whether, we were going to have replacing teachers. And I don't think anybody is really starting to see all of those things happen. But instead, there's a conversation I think that's going to happen in 2024 around how do we use AI to make instruction better? So maybe the types of questions we ask the students aren't, is 2 + 2 4, but how do we analyze these issues and get students to think deeply around what's going on? And so I think that educators in the field are going to be flooded with new product opportunities. And one of the pieces of advice I always give is wait and make sure that the product exists first, but that it actually does the things that you want it to do, and utilize those tools to make education better. And then I said I would offer one hope. I don't think that in 2024 there is really any serious talk of an ESSER reauthorization. In a lot of ways, to educators, ESSER still feels new, but it was passed in 2015. After the presidential election, the middle of that term will, be 10 years since an ESSER reauthorization. And so I don't think that we're going to see that in the next year, but I hope that we start to have conversations amongst policymakers around setting a framework for what can be the focus of ESSER reauthorization. I mean, Secretary Jenner talked about going to through course assessment. Again, right after I left the department, they announced a waiver in one state to allow essentially a faster movement towards a state going to some of these type of assessments. And as I've crossed the nation in my new role, I don't know a single state that's not thinking in some way differently about assessment. And the conversation is often around, well, does ESSER prevent or does it allow this? And I think some of that is starting to get sorted out. But in the middle of that, after 10 years of ESSER, what's next? Where are we going? And I think that that's a conversation that may start in 2024. Maybe that gets pushed into 25 or 26 after the election. But I think it's something that educators need to be thinking about, where if the door is open for that, what are the possibilities and what facets would they want to see in it? And I think Secretary Jenner talked about the future of high school. Often that gets paired with mastery learning or competency-based education. I think all of that flows into assessment, because assessment is essentially going to drive a lot of that and what happens in classrooms. And, I think at the Raise the Bar initiative that the Secretary has launched, which talks about academic recovery, which talks about mental health, which talks about teacher shortages, multilingualism. I think that those conversations will continue. But I really think that because we have a split Congress, a lot of the really big changes, if changes are to occur, are largely going to happen in district and state policy in the next year.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. I love that you kind of ended yours with hope. I think so often we talk about the issues, and so having that hope for 2024. I am going to kind of piggyback off of something that you said about AI. So Secretary Jenner brought up AI and what that's doing in Indiana. So we're going to ask a little bit more about what you're seeing there. And I think, Dr. Jamil, what does this look like in a teacher prep program? And then kind of circle back and finish out with Dr. Lane. Is there anything else that you're seeing potentially for 2024? So Secretary Jenner, if you could come in, ChatGPT, other accessible artificial intelligence models are coming out. It came out the end of 2022, and it raised lots of questions for students, parents, educators during that 2023 school year. Like Dr. Lane alluded to, what do we use it? What is it? How do we use it? How are educators in Indiana addressing the use of AI in schools?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So much of our opportunity in education comes from connections like this, where you meet people and they're like, how about this? What about this? And so our movement, our very, very quick movement, quite frankly, in AI in Indiana came from a random call that I got in the spring of 23 from the CEO of Excel and Ed, Patricia Levesque, who said, hey, what are you all doing with Excel and Ed? What are you all doing with AI? And I didn't have a lot to say at that point. I was like, well, I mean, we're interested in it. To Dr. Lane's point, we need to pursue it. We need to figure it out. And she said, well, how about talking to Sal Khan? He's starting Conmigo, or building that out. So I hopped on a call with Sal, and that was probably in May of 2023. And our big question, again, was posed similarly to how Dr. Lane said, but how might we leverage AI for the good? How might we leverage AI to do some of the things that are taking so much of our teachers' work time? How can we leverage AI to increase high quality student tutoring for children? So we set out with that key problem statement and launched a competitive grant across Indiana to consider a variety of vendors who are in the AI space. I would caution any policymakers, though, not every vendor just like not every vendor in curriculum is created equal, not every vendor in AI is created equal right now. So we had a pretty strong rubric. And so we're using 5 vendors right now in AI in a large pilot, 45,000 students, 2,800 teachers are being trained. And the primary vendor is Conmigo, who was able to get that. The other piece that I did not share is when Sal and I talked, he said that he was piloting Conmigo around the nation. And one of the top schools users was, I think, in New Jersey. The other top one was in Northern Indiana. So I immediately picked up the phone and called that superintendent and said, I'd love to talk to all the teachers who are using this. Is this the real deal? Like, is this really working? And so the teachers, and hearing from them and how it's been helpful to them, that was our why and why we made that big investment. It was about a $2 million investment. And we're studying that data, and we'll determine. It's not a budget session coming up in Indiana, but we'll be making a recommendation in the future so that our teachers can continue, our students can continue to leverage AI for the good.
Yeah, Secretary Jenner, if we can build off of that with Dr. Jamil, that teacher experience. So how do we see this playing out for teachers?
You know, it's interesting. I think that as with most new technology, there is an initial panic and fear of, and I think we've seen that broadly, like, oh, well, will students use this for teaching? Or try cheating? Will it interfere with our ability to assess what they actually know? And I know that in the higher ed space, some of that has required a lot of careful consideration. I have the benefit of being a faculty in a learning sciences program. And so we actually have been examining this carefully, as in what are the assets that come with an AI space. And I think one of the places is there is an opportunity to reduce a burden that teachers face. There's efficiencies that come with it. And could we sort of take off some of the burden in assessment? Could we automate certain aspects of assessment so that we can focus in on those more specific areas that help provide feedback for students? So that's one piece. I think the other place where we have to start thinking and are thinking carefully is related to the future of work. So when we think about the future of work, AI is a reality in the workplace already and is going to continue to increase in its role. Being afraid of incorporating AI in our teaching is very similar to being afraid of the internet 30 years ago. And so I think that this is a reality. It's a piece of what will be a resource in workplaces, and how do we best integrate it to allow students to solve problems, to learn how to use this as any other resource to expand what they are able to do in their learning. In terms of teacher preparation, I think that we are starting to consider specific ways we can incorporate AI-based technologies into our teacher preparation programs as well. Building off of things like virtual reality and virtual humans to increase opportunities for practice. Well, AI technologies open up a lot of spaces to start creating real responses to teaching scenarios and allowing pre-service teachers to practice how they would respond to things in ways that we haven't been able to generate efficiently so far. So I do think there's a lot of spaces where we are considering how to leverage AI technologies, but one of the areas that I think requires attention is policy, right? So whether it's at the district level, at the higher educational institutional level, having clearly crafted policies around that will create safety in using it. And right now, that is one of the concerns, is if we don't have clearly articulated policies, how do we safely engage with technology? And I think that requires a lot of collaborative thinking across the field. So with researchers, with teacher educators, with teachers, with students, with the workplace. So, future employers, to really create clear guidelines that are developmental in nature, because the appropriate use of AI in education with fifth graders should look different than it does with high school seniors, should look different than it does with pre-service teachers. And as a developmental scientist, I think that's where we have to really get into the weeds and start understanding how do we appropriately leverage these things so that they are supportive of learning and supportive of authentic assessment and practice and things that we know support learning. Whether it's in reading or in mathematics, all of these spaces, but we have to do the work. We can't go in blind because as we learn from so much technology, social media, right? That there are so many positive ways we can use technology that is supportive of learning and development. But if we just dive in with both feet and don't consider the implications, then we often find ourselves trying to put the genie back in the bottle. And so I think we are trying to navigate that space in as much of an interdisciplinary lens as we can, speaking to developers, speaking to educators, speaking to students to really understand what are the best ways that we can use this technology. The other thing we have to consider is most of our students are digital natives, right? That they have grown up in a world where their devices are an extension of themselves. And so their sort of experiences with AI and how they are using it already to support their own learning without that guidance are, I think, a valid part of what we need to consider and to evaluate, because so much of that is being created on the ground by students already. And how can we actually learn from them, I think, is an important part of how we frame our research and our efforts to develop that policy. So that's sort of the space we're in right now, is having those conversations.
Yeah, that collaboration is going to be key for getting on the same page about what AI is. Dr. Lane, can you kind of close us out with, you kicked us off, and can you close us out with any of your thoughts on what AI looks like in 2024?
Well, I read a report a while back about, how to create the best policy around AI, and the department kind of doubled down on this, and that I think that AI is best when humans are involved in the work that you're doing, right? And I think that's the part that's missing. Is often people think of AI as something that's running in the background, and a robot or a bot or whatever is just producing information. But when I engage with AI, I actually do an icebreaker in almost every meeting that I lead, and it's the first time I meet people, where I have people interview each other, put what they learned in the interview in AI, and then ask it to spit out a poem, and then you read the poem to the other person, right? But even in doing that little exercise, you have to learn to manipulate your prompt to get AI to say the things that you want it to say. And if you assume that you're going to have an input, it's going to give you an output, and you don't have to do any work, that's not largely the best way to approach AI. And so, I think we have to train kids and teachers and principals on, how to ask the right questions, and then whether AI will help you with that. I think that we need to make sure that in the vendor space, we have the guardrails in place to make sure anything they produce is protecting student privacy and data. I think we have to make sure that we fully understand the opportunities we have. I mean, I had a cool opportunity several months back to sit with an AI creator, and I won't promote any specific product, but essentially it's a virtual chat where you can actually have a conversation, and essentially we were able to prompt it to ask me questions, so it got to have a sense of my academic ability in an area, and then it was able to design a lesson that then the teacher could deliver that was unique to my specific needs. And I mean, just think about if you knew that much about your student because of some of the questions that you were prompting the AI to ask, and then you could turn around and actually in your small group instruction be very honed in on what we call zone of proximal development, and making sure that we're going deeply to where the student needs to learn at the moment based on their context and based on what they're not ready for yet. And so I think that that is the best place for AI. But I will say there's a whole other world of what's going on in AI that doesn't necessarily have to touch students. How it can make our hiring and recruitment easier, how it can make our financial processes and budgeting easier, how it could help us think through bus routing because we have a national bus driver shortage. And so could our routes be more efficient to make sure that we have them all full every day? Is it able to better predict how much cheese we need for school lunch so that we're buying better and not wasting resources there? I mean, there's just a million things that you could think of. And I think the key is to make sure that as we're going through procurement or vetting partners and all of this, that we actually are working with partners that aren't just talking about the things that AI could do, but they're ready for what AI will do. And that, schools are largely not the place that I think we should be testing new solutions. Schools should be a place once they're tested, then we should put them into place. And so I think that we're on the verge from a lot of solutions coming to fruition that can really help. But I think we have to be critical from the human standpoint on whether it's actually meeting our needs and make sure that we have solutions that are protective of students.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. So you kind of closed out with one of your hopes. I would love to close out our session. Secretary Jenner, Dr. Jamil, what is one hope or excitement that you have for 2024? Secretary Jenner, we'll start with you.
I mean, narrowing it to one is tough. What I'm probably most excited about our work around rethinking high school in Indiana and making sure the 4 years are as valuable as possible for students. We have work to do, and we know that from survey data you just shared. We know that from Gallup survey data of parents in our state, survey data of students, and survey data of our educators and business and industry. Everyone's saying, let's go. So we have a great momentum to consider what apprenticeships might look like and just how to really rethink that space to make it more valuable. That's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dr. Jamil, you can close this out.
You know what? I'm going to say that there is a generational shift occurring, right? We are sort of watching young people who have kind of lived, if you think about starting in about 2008, the world's been a tough place. A lot of different things have happened, a couple of recessions, a pandemic. And my hope is the incredible resilience of our youth, right? That there is such creativity and drive and excitement. And as these young people are entering the workforce, higher education, they're really starting to bring new ideas. And I'm excited about the potential collaborations we have with them. I think there is such ingenuity, and that is my hope is that we can actually listen to their resilience and ingenuity and learn from it, because I think they have some really amazing things to offer.
Well, Dr. Jamil, Dr. Lane, Secretary Jenner, thank you so much for joining us today. The Institute deeply appreciates you all making time. You're all very busy, and we are excited to have you here. Before closing today's discussion, I do want to turn everyone to our upcoming K-12 webinars. So our themes in the new year kick off with public dollars, private choices. I'm talking about school choice in 2024 on January 18th. We also encourage you to join us for other upcoming K-12 webinars listed on the screen. You can register for these discussions by going to our website. We'll post that in the chat for you. And with that, thank you all again for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon, and we're excited to see what happens in 2024. So thank you all.
Thank you.